Many of us spend our whole life in search of purpose, desperately seeking meaningful ways to make a difference in the world with the short amount of time we are given. The Deploying High podcast has been designed to help you analyze what gives you purpose.
Hello there. I'm Chief Gene Saunders, founder and CEO of Project Lifesaver International, and your host for Deploying High. Today, we're privileged to have a subject matter expert in a topic that we covered earlier in one of our episodes, and that is First Responder PTSD. This is a big topic that's going around now, and it's been accentuated here in the state of Florida with the suicides of several officers on each coast. I think it's an important subject, and it's one that we need to delve into even deeper to bring a better understanding and maybe even bring some officers to the forefront that may need some intervention. Our guest today is Dr. David Rozek. Dr. Rozek is an assistant professor at UCF Restores and on the Department of Psychology at the University of Central Florida. He received his PhD from the University of Notre Dame, completed his residency at the Orlando Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and has worked as a research fellow at the University of Utah. He's also held faculty appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Utah and as a director of training at the National Center for Veteran Studies. He is a Beck Scholar and regularly provides training around the country to clinicians and medical professionals, on best practices for suicidal patients. The thing that is most in our focus now is he centers or focuses on first responder and military PSD, a subject that I would really like to get into even deeper because I think, as I said earlier, it is extremely important. Doctor, welcome to Deploying High.
Thank you for having me.
I guess the first question is, just so everybody kind of gets to know you, is who is Dr., and I hope I pronounced it right, Rozek?
You did. Perfectly.
Oh, well, very good. A star for me. That's one of the first times. Tell us about who is Dr. Rozek. How did you get to where you are, and how did you develop an interest in what you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up actually in the Midwest, so I always get that out there because people think I sound Canadian every now and then. I'm from Minnesota originally.
Well, that's close.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say right there. And so I grew up in Minnesota, had some military members in my family, and my best friend went into the military. When he was 18, when I went off to college, he went to military and always stayed in touch with him, was the best man at his wedding, had a lot of military friends because of that. Now, I ended up doing my undergrad at Wisconsin and then my PhD at the University of Notre Dame, as you mentioned. And during my training, I got really interested in kind of understanding more about how do we actually treat mental health, and specifically depression. But then I started, like I said, had a lot of military friends, and unfortunately, a few of them did die by suicide. And I started working at the VA and got really, really interested in how do we actually help these people? How do we really focus on suicide specifically? And that got me going into understanding treatments. How do we kind of look at maybe who's at risk for suicide? And ultimately, it got me into the VA working quite a bit. And I did a lot of my work within military active duty and then veterans, of course, as well. And then when I kind of transitioned out of the VA, I started noticing there's this other whole population of first responders who are going to all of these often terrible situations. Who do we call when we're in trouble? We call first responders. And they're reacting and coming to all these different things on a daily basis. And when I think about it, unfortunately, there's no VA system for first responders. Now, there is for veterans and definitely should be, but what are we doing to take care of our first responders? And so that got me to kind of translate some of the programs that I was doing out in Utah and now at UCF Restores into the first responder world and really helping to provide that mental health care.
Well, that is, I'm very glad to see that because this has been something that's, I don't know, I don't want to use the term ignored, but it's kind of had a blind eye turned to it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being a veteran cop for 33 years, you're right. You see a lot of things, you participate in a lot of things. And, you know, we hear this sometimes that you need to be able to talk about it. You need to be able to, okay, back when I was a cop and even now, who do you talk to about it? You don't bring these things home to your family. You know, you're not going to come home and tell your family all the gruesome things you just did or that you just got in a fight and almost got your rear end kicked all over the, you know, the pavement. It's just not the kind of thing that makes for a family conversation. But I firmly believe, and I don't know if you watched our episode before on PTSD, but we talked to David Wagner, who was a veteran police officer and retired because of PTSD. And I firmly believe, and correct me if you disagree, that, you know, just jump right in. I think anybody that's been a first responder for any length of time suffers from some form of PTSD. And I hasten that in describing the fact that, you know, when I was a first responder, I was pretty much stone-willed. You know, you store all this stuff. And now I've noticed that now that I've gotten away from it, I'm not doing it anymore, my emotions can be kicked into high gear at nothing. And I'm not talking about anger. I'm talking about the sadness or respond. Yeah. I can respond to a movie in full-blown tears. I never used to do that. Now, I don't know if that's PTSD or what it is, but I kind of have a feeling that maybe it's a little touch of it. So this makes me very, very glad that you're doing this. So in your studies, what have you found?
Yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit on what you said is that what we see a lot within law enforcement or first responders is the job has this constant on the go, right? So you're jumping from one thing to the next thing. You can always get into new things. I'll leave it at that, but there's always things that you can get into. And what we see is sometimes you'll get exposed to these horrible events, whether it's a accident with a family or pediatric drowning or things like that. And what we often see is, yep, I'm here, and now I'm going to jump to the next thing. And I'm going to stay busy at work, and maybe I'm going to pick up extra shifts, or, you know, I'm going to kind of keep myself constantly busy so that realistically I don't have to think about that, right? I may see more things along the way, but I'm trying to keep myself busy. And what we see then a lot of times is we get to the retirement age and we slow down a little bit initially, and all of that stuff comes back, but it doesn't come up the way that we think it does. Right? So it's not always this anger coming out. Now, sometimes it is. But like you said, it could be I watch a movie and it brings up that huge emotional response, that sadness. And so I think that's always really important to kind of touch on is that my goal and kind of some of my research has been, now people aren't breaking down my door on a day-to-day basis trying to talk to me about PTSD or mental health in terms of first responders wanting treatment. But the people that they are talking to are their peers, right? Like you said, they don't want to bring some of this stuff home. They want to talk to someone, though, who knows a little bit about what they've been through. And, you know, I hear this all the time. Well, you know, you're a great doc, but you're not my first call. When something bad happens, I call my buddy, whoever, right? Who's been through some stuff with me. And kind of what I've been doing in the research world is how do we then equip our peer support teams? And these don't have to be official peer support teams, because we know, honestly, everyone in law enforcement and the first responder world, you're all peers. So how do we train people to have some of those skills when someone comes to you and says, hey, that last accident or that last investigation I went through, it's really sticking with me and I'm having trouble sleeping or I'm fighting all the time with my significant other. Now, I'll say that the way I say it is very different. It's probably much more colorful when it comes out from someone else. But how do I respond to that as a peer in a way that's helpful? How do we equip our first responders with some of those tools that we know work. And so that's what a lot of my research has been into. How do we identify that? How do we talk about it? How do we kind of refer when needed? And how do we also, on the other side, how do mental health providers get trained to be culturally competent? Because I don't know if you've ever heard the story of a first responder going to a therapist and they tell them something that happened and the therapist starts crying and says, "Oh no, don't tell me anymore." We want to avoid that. We want the therapist to be equipped and ready to talk about some of these things too.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure you've run into it. Of course, I don't want to age myself too much, but back in my day, you never talked about it to anybody, mainly because in your internal opinion and in the culture that was spread, that it showed weakness. You don't need to talk. You just handle it. You just do it. You just handle it. And you certainly didn't tell your supervisors, because then they're liable to think you're not competent to do the job. And I think that is still out there. I really do. And when you say talk to peers, I think there's a lot of validity to that. And I use this often. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Full Metal Jacket. All right. Do you probably remember the scene where the journalist is talking to the machine gunner, the maggot? Mm-hmm. Yep. And he says, "You can talk the talk. Can you walk the walk?" And I have seen it. I have been a part of it. Cops build a wall.
Yes.
And if you're not within the police culture and you have had the same experiences, then you're an outsider. And I'm not talking to you. You can see that when they walk into a classroom and it's a non-police officer teaching.
Yep.
They have to break down that wall before they can ever get through to them, because they have a lot of the attitude, what is he or she doing here? She doesn't know what I go through. What is she going to tell me that I don't already know?
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting that you have started this program. And I'd like to mention that you're going to be at our conference and you're going to be presenting this program, which I really recommend to first responders. Whether you think you're going to have PSD or not is not important. You need to know about it. You need to be able to recognize it. So I'd kind of like for you to, if you will, let's tell our listeners, what is your program and how do you do that?
Yeah, so we have a peer support program that's called the REACT training program. So it stands for Recognize, Evaluate, Advocate, Coordinate, and Track. And the idea here is that we really want peers to be able to recognize stress injuries that happen. So that doesn't always mean someone's going to come up and say, "Hey, I'm struggling," right? But we should be able to look at behavior changes. When you notice something's different in someone you work with, maybe we should check in and figure out what's going on and kind of assess what's going on and see if we can be helpful. We want to also, a lot of these peer support training programs, they give you like a list of symptoms, right? They're like, if someone's not sleeping well, if someone's arguing with their significant other, and it's all these things that happen in day-to-day life. And it's like, yeah, so if I see someone that's sad or angry or kind of getting in fights all the time, I should do something. But then the presentation ends. And it's just like, those are the symptoms. And we really tried to avoid that in our program, where we say, hey, here are some zones. Here's what green, yellow, orange, and red look like. And when you identify someone's in one of these kind of orange or red zone or even yellow zone, here are some skills that you can actually use. And so some of them sometimes seem like simple skills, but things like asking open-ended questions are actually really difficult to do sometimes. And what we see within first responders is open-ended questions are not always the go-to, right? It's often asking yes/no questions to get the information quick. And when we get into the area of mental health world, we want to be asking people open-ended questions so that they are answering and giving us more information. And then we tell them, so what happens when someone brings up something like suicide, for example, or they're having thoughts, and they may not use the word suicide, but we know they're having some of those dark thoughts. What do we do then? And so we don't want our first reaction when someone brings up mental health or suicide for it to immediately be, oh no, stop talking about that, go talk to someone else. But how do we engage in that conversation? And yes, we may and often do as a peer or have the peer specialist refer to a mental health provider. But first, we want them to engage in that conversation and feel comfortable and have some of those tools.
So in your studies and research, are you finding or have you found police departments, fire departments, and even some SAR guys are reacting in a positive manner to what you're doing?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I've worked with first responders now for quite a few years now, over almost 7 years now. And it's interesting because I start out a lot of my slides, and you'll see this at the training, and I promise it'll make its way onto one of the slides, where we have kind of that suck it up buttercup.
Yep.
It'll be front and center. And so we get that mentality a lot. And like you said, kind of coming in from the outside world, it's like, well, does this guy or does this group know anything about us? You know, exactly what you said. They may not know what I'm going through or what we do. And so what I find really, really helpful is that we come in, we have some background. We've everyone at our center at UCF Restores has done a lot of cultural competency training, which means we have done ride-alongs. We've been to departments. We've spent time with first responders at a lot of different levels to kind of get an understanding. And so what we see in our program is we've taken feedback over and over again from first responders. React was actually developed with first responders as part of the development team. And so when they see what we have put together, they go, oh, yeah, this does fit with what I'm doing. And we actually have some kind of data that we collect at all of our trainings that overall people really enjoy this training and they find it useful. So that's one of the biggest takeaways for me is people have said, yes, I know situations where I can use these skills. I've had situations in the past where these skills would have been useful, and I plan on being able to use these skills with people at work or other peers.
I think that'll definitely be beneficial. And earlier I mentioned that we had an episode with David Wagner, and you being at the conference, and he's going to be at the conference also to speak. I think this is going to be a great connectivity. And as far as information and research that can be shared and conversation. And one other thing I'd like to mention, because we're so interested in what you do, I know there's been conversation of you and your program and Project Lifesaver doing some sort of partnership and us promoting your program even more. And we are going to do that. I think this is very, very important because I have seen officers that, it used to be a kind of a not a joke, but it was also often said in kind of sleight of hand humor. When an officer retires 3 years, well, 3 years what? 3 years he's dead. Mm-hmm. Well, why is he dead? Well, usually they either commit suicide or they have nothing to do and they just go away. And I think this is another step to prolonging these guys and girls into recognizing what they're entering into and what might be affecting them. Because it's easy, and I know, okay, I'll get through it. It's no big deal. I'm tough. I can handle it. Well, I think we need to make these officers understand, and I think your program is doing it. That's not necessarily the case. Especially if you're dealing with mental health problems. It's not like you got cut, you get stitches, it heals, you're done. It just kind of lingers there. Is that the way you would describe it?
So I definitely see it that way when it's not addressed. So the best thing, and one of my favorite parts about working with law enforcement and first responders is you all are very resilient. But what happens is you'll have this type of what I would consider like a stress injury, and you ignore it, right? So if you ignore a stress fracture in your foot and you continue to run and work out on it, it turns into a big problem. Same thing happens with mental health is if we ignore it, it turns into this big problem, and it's so pervasive throughout all of our life that you see all of those negative consequences, things like maybe being passed up for promotion, relationship issues, and then turning kind of even darker to those thoughts of maybe I should end my life. And like you said, I've heard that same adage the 3 years, and it's often, I think, because we're not really focused on mental health as much as we could be within law enforcement and first responders.
Well, let me ask you a really loaded question here. Back in the day, and I know that some of it still goes on, whenever we worked an evening shift, and at the end of the shift, we had what was referred to in the movie a long time ago, choir practice. Of course, choir practice involved a lot of heavy drinking, a lot of horseplay that sometimes got really physical. Was that some way of relieving some of this stress or handling some of this stress, or was it just an excuse to do these kind of things?
No, I think it is a way to relieve some of that stress. Now, depending on what happened, it could be considered, normal, healthy, and some of it may have gotten out of hand, and we may want to look at different coping strategies. But it's interesting because when I'm going to use alcohol as an example. So people talk about, I do these trainings about first responder mental health all over. And it's so funny when I come in and I talk about coping strategies, and I say, well, what are some coping strategies? And the first thing I hear from the group is drinking. And I go, hey, going to the bar and grabbing a drink with friends actually isn't a bad coping strategy, because they always think they're going to get a rise out of me like, oh, no, don't drink, zero drinking. I'm like, it depends, right? And so even on those times where we're feeling overwhelmed and we're drinking too much, it can be a warning sign, right? Especially if it's out of our normal habit, and friends might notice that. And I want to make it really clear, I'm not saying that, every time something stressful comes, you should go get drunk and just drink in excess. But there are going to be times where that feels like this is the only thing that I can do. And again, if we have the support network within a department where people are saying, hey, that's odd for someone, let me check up on him the next day, or check up on her the next day, or the next week, and actually having some follow-up around it. So a lot of times these kind of get-togethers, whatever they were or are a good stress relief. But again, what we're missing is that circle back. So what do we do? Is that person okay after that? Was that outing enough for them in terms of now they're kind of reset and they're good to go? Or is it lingering with them and maybe they need some additional support and help?
Agreed. Well, Doctor, I really appreciate talking to you today. Our time, unfortunately, is running short, so I need to do a little promotion stuff. I am really looking forward to your presentation at the conference and the training, and with you getting together with David Wagner. But I'm also looking very forward to working with you on promoting this program and getting some more of these first responders the information they need, and even some of these departments the information they need to deal with this situation, because I honestly feel nowadays it may be getting out of hand. So I think it's something that is should be on the top of the priority list. So you have been with Dr. David Rozek, PhD, working with the University of Central Florida on First Responder PTSD. I'm Gene Saunders, the founder and CEO of Project Lifesaver International. I invite you to come to our conference to hear him and to attend his training class. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet to our Deploying High network, please do so on Anchor, Spotify, or the YouTube network. Looking forward to our next episode, and looking forward again to working with the doctor on this particularly important aspect of police work and first responders. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deploying High podcast with Chief Gene Saunders, brought to you by Project Lifesaver International. Deploying High would like to thank all of our supporters across the country and around the world. If you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe to our channel, make a donation, and don't forget to tell a friend about us. All proceeds from the Deploying High podcast go to support Project Lifesaver International, online at projectlifesaver.org, the original 501c3 nonprofit organization.